My name is Paul Dietrich. I'm the director of the Liberal Studies program and the Religious Studies program here at the university. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker as part of this year's President's Lecture Series. I would like to, first of all, thank President and Mrs. Dennison for their gracious hospitality and their continued support of this vital tradition. For many of us on and off campus, this series, the President's Lecture Series, is the university's signal public contribution to the intellectual life in Missoula. I would also like to thank Professor Richard Drake for his indefatigable efforts in organizing the series with help from Michelle Shaughnessy of the President's Office. This lecture is also presented in conjunction with the Lorica Roman Catholic Visiting Speakers Fund, which is dedicated to bringing to campus individuals who have made outstanding contributions to our nation's intellectual life. The first Lorica visitor, also a presidential lecturer, was Judge John Noonan of the Ninth Circuit Court in San Francisco. Tonight it is my privilege to introduce this year's speaker. John W. O'Malley, distinguished professor of church history at Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, Mass., earned his doctorate in history from Harvard University. He teaches and publishes in the history of religious culture, religious art, medieval scholasticism, Renaissance humanism, and the history of preaching and sacred rhetoric. Among his 14 books are Praise and Blame in Renaissance Rome, Rhetoric, Doctrine, and Reform in the Sacred Orators of the Papal Court from 1450 to 1520. That's one book. That's an academic's title, isn't it? Duke University Press. The First Jesuits. He started opting for shorter titles. Harvard University Press, translated into 6 languages and Braille. Trent and All That, renaming Catholicism in the early modern era, also published by Harvard. And finally, Four Cultures of the West, also from Harvard, published earlier this year. In addition to those volumes, which are some of his books, he has published 3 volumes of collected articles, which offer a selection from more than 100 published articles. He has also edited volumes on humanity and divinity in Renaissance and Reformation, Catholicism in early modern history, and 3 volumes of the collected works of Erasmus, books on the Jesuits and the arts and sciences, and a volume on the legacy of the Second Vatican Council. He's also at work on a new book on the Second Vatican Council. He is a regular contributor of articles and reviews to the Jesuit magazine America. In 2001, the University of Toronto Press published a Festschrift in his honor entitled Early Modern Catholicism, Essays in Honor of John W. O'Malley, S.J. This collection of essays in his honor demonstrates a consensus among scholars that Professor O'Malley is a pioneer among early modern historians, a scholar who, by emphasizing the diversity, vitality, and complexity of Catholicism in the early modern era, has helped to dismantle an older monolithic interpretation of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and has changed the way we think about early modern Europe. He has done so with a scholarly style marked by eloquence, imagination, creativity, and generosity of spirit. His numerous honors and awards include election last year to the Accademia di San Carlo, the Ambrosian Library in Milan. He has also served as president of the Renaissance Society of America, president of the American Catholic Historical Society, fellow American Academy of Arts and Sciences, member American Philosophical Society, fellow American Academy in Rome, John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, and fellowships with the American Council of Learned Societies and the National Endowment of Humanities. The holder of 12 honorary doctorates and 5 visiting professorships, Father O'Malley has also served twice as a delegate to the General Congregation of the Society of Jesus in Rome. In his recent book on 4 Cultures of the West, prophetic, academic, humanist, and artistic, Professor O'Malley acknowledges that he holds multiple passports and participates in all 4 cultures. And although he spends most of his waking hours in the academic cultures, his friends tell him that he belongs in the humanist culture. And I would like to second the impression of his friends and close by commenting on the character of the scholarship of this contemporary Renaissance humanist. In his introduction to the 3 volumes on the spiritual writings of his beloved Erasmus, John O'Malley defines theology for Erasmus as piety joined with skill in speaking on sacred subjects. Erasmus's theology, or pietas, exemplified 7 qualities, or modes, according to O'Malley. It is Catholic, corrective, accommodating, clear, reconciliatory, communitarian, and learned. It is Catholic with a small c. Its Catholicity stands for a cultural comprehensiveness. It is corrective, the dialectical opposite of traditionalism. And here I would borrow Jaroslav Pelikan's definition of traditionalism as the dead faith of the living, as opposed to tradition, which is the living faith of the dead. Erasmus's thought is corrective, imbued by a spirit of reform. It is accommodating to the status, conditions, and the personality of the individual, mindful of the fundamental rhetorical principle of the congruence of the speech with the audience. Accommodation also acknowledges and embraces variety and diversity. It is marked by clarity of, or simplicity of expression, even in the discussion of complex ideas. It manifests a reconciliatory or moderating quality of faith in conversation and compromise. It is communitarian or societal, as opposed to solipsistic or isolationist. And finally, it is learned, deeply sourced in the languages and traditions of humanist discourse. Such, according to O'Malley, are the qualities or modes of Erasmus's thought. Erasmus, the prince of the humanist, the near-perfect type of the third culture of the humanist. But this list of qualities, Catholic, corrective, accommodating, clear, reconciliatory, communitarian, and learned, is also, I submit, a near-perfect mirror of the quality or character of O'Malley's humanist scholarship, his pietas. I was reminded the other day that Mark Twain said that he hated it when people praised him because they didn't go on nearly long enough. I, however, have been given written instructions to be short and pertinent. So, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to give you a modern Prince of Humanists, Professor John O'Malley.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that wonderful introduction. You just didn't go on long enough. My title is Trent and the Making of Modern Catholicism. For educated persons with an interest in history, the word Trent rings a bell. Faint, however, and muffled is the sound. Wasn't Trent a church council? Wasn't it against Luther? Or something? If these persons happen to be Roman Catholics, Trent might even sound like a summons to arms, for they've heard either that Trent wrought all the bad things that the Second Vatican Council, 1962-65, saved them from, or it established all the good things that the Vatican Council robbed them of. Few are they, including theologians, who move much deeper than these cliches. Yet even these cliches suggest that Trent, whatever it was important. Well, what was Trent? Before we go any further, maybe we should review some bread and butter facts. The Protestant Reformation exploded in 1517 with Luther's posting of his 95 Theses, and it rapidly gained ground in Germany, so that within 6 or 7 years, it seemed to many observers that it would carry the day. It in fact began to suffer some setbacks there in Germany, but relatively soon was making hidden inroads into Scandinavia, England, Scotland, and France, Eastern Europe, and even Italy. Catholics in various ways tried to defend their religion and counter the new one, but their efforts were scattered and for the most part ineffectual. From the very beginning of the upheaval, the German Emperor, Charles V, became the leading champion of a council as the most equitable and effective way to deal with it. But for political reasons, other Catholic leaders, like Francis I, King of France, and even Clement VII, Pope 1523-34, successfully delayed its convocation. However, the next Pope, Paul III, successfully convened the council, which opened at the little town of Trent in the northernmost part of Italy. This assembly, principally of Catholic bishops, met over the course of 18 years in three distinct periods: 1545 to 47, 1551 to 52, 1562 to 63. 1555 to 1563, a whole generation. The protracted length of the council and the long delays between the three periods were due to political, military, and ecclesiastical factors that persistently threatened the very life of the council. Even in its first years, the worsening, ever more suspicious and distrustful relationship between Emperor Charles V and Pope Paul III and the conflicting aims they had for the council delayed its opening and helped prolong its history. Although reckoned by Roman Catholics as the 19th ecumenical council in the history of the Church, only 31 bishops were present when the council opened in December 1545, a sign of how dispirited and disorganized Catholic leadership was, and the number never exceeded 200 out of a potential pool of at least 3 times that many. Moreover, only a small handful of bishops present at the final period of the council had taken part in the previous 2 periods. The membership was almost entirely new, so it was almost another council. Although the legates, or ambassadors, appointed by the popes presided over the council, the 3 popes who reigned during the 3 periods of the council never set foot in Trent. They tried to control the agenda from several hundred miles away. As one bishop at Trent put it, in previous councils, the Holy Spirit descended upon the bishops from on high. But in this council, he arrives in the mail from Rome. Nonetheless, the popes were only partially successful in controlling the agenda and the course the council took. Far from being a smoothly functioning organization following a clear blueprint, the council was often marked by turmoil, sharp debate, leading many observers to believe it could never successfully be brought to conclusion. By the time the council met, any real possibility of healing the religious division was long past, and for all practical purposes, the council, by clarifying the Catholic position on disputed issues, set a seal upon a situation already beyond repair. Through such clarification, it imparted to Catholic leadership a bracing sense of cohesion, and moreover, by its so-called disciplinary or reform decrees, enacted to change the behavioral patterns, especially of bishops and the clergy, it provided a clear-cut agenda for that leadership that would have profound and long-lasting effects. The importance of Trent for the subsequent history of the Roman Catholic Church, and thus of the history of the West, can hardly be overestimated, although recent research has shown how distorted have been some interpretations of it and how limited the success of some attempts to implement it. Well, if Trent is so important, why don't more people, including scholars, know more about it? We should, it seems. In 1975, Hubert Yadin, perhaps the most distinguished and prolific Catholic Church historian of the 20th century, published the 4th and final volume of his History of the Council. The publication of that Geschichte des Konzils von Trient marked a great moment in ecclesiastical scholarship, recognized as such by anyone who has taken the trouble to read it. Few, it seems, have taken that trouble. The first 2 volumes were translated into English in 1957 and 61, shortly after they appeared in German. They aroused interest, to some extent, because they appeared just as Vatican Council II was getting underway. What, some people wanted to know, was the relationship between these 2 councils, especially if Vatican II was, as some said, the end of the Counter-Reformation, just as Trent was its embodiment. But soon interest sagged badly, with the old cliches about the council reappearing despite Yedine's efforts. The last two volumes have never been translated into English, and I know few English language historians who have worked their way through them. Yedine's great work, as the little girl said about the book about snakes, tells people more about Trent than they want to know. And it tells them in a way that makes it difficult to see the woods for the trees. Moreover, except for Yedine's ongoing publications, few serious historical studies of Trent have appeared in any language since the 1960s. Why? Partly because Yedine did such a good job. He left few stones unturned, and interests shift. Lately, interest in Catholicism in the 16th and 17th centuries has surged among scholars, especially in France, Italy, and North America, but it has bypassed Trent itself to concentrate on the period after the council. These scholars are curious about many things, some of which have nothing directly to do with the council, but they are also serious about how Trent was interpreted and implemented, which sometimes comes down to studying what crimes or good deeds were done in its name without necessarily reflecting what the council itself actually enacted. Let me give you a very concrete example of what I mean. All Protestants put their religious services into the vernacular, whereas the Catholic Mass remained in Latin. This would become a powerful symbol of the difference between the two brands of Western Christianity. Everybody assumes Trent was responsible for that difference. The council did make two very brief statements on the matter, 2 sentences really. The first, quotation, "It has not been deemed advisable to decree that the Mass be celebrated everywhere in the vernacular tongue." The second, which removes all doubt about the council's intention, "It is forbidden to maintain that the Mass ought to be celebrated only in the vernacular tongue." In other words, it is legitimate, despite what the Protestants say, to celebrate the liturgy in Latin. This is a far cry from decreeing that it must be celebrated in that tongue, and a far cry from prohibiting the vernacular. Trent left the question open. Here we have a telling illustration of how the council began to be misconstrued and manipulated almost before the ink was dry, and thus of how Trent began often to bear only a distorted relationship to what the Council of Trent actually intended. How and why did this happen? Immediately after the council, powerful forces tried to take the council captive for their own purposes. Popes, bishops, kings, Catholic polemicists, Protestant polemicists, and so forth. And they interpreted it to say what they thought it should have said or what they wanted it to say. Furthermore, although the decrees of the council were printed and fairly widely diffused, no one until the 20th century really had full access to the sources behind those documents that revealed the discussions and debates in the council that would help in arriving at a sound interpretation. But there is also a problem with the very literary form of the documents of the council. They are a huge pile of regulations and abstract statements, one after the other, staccato style, often expressed in highly technical language, put together by a huge committee over 18 years. They are some of the dullest reading imaginable. Only the most intrepid would undertake to hack their way through that thicket of almost 300 pages in English translation. Only the most caffeine-charged could possibly stay awake. Well, over the course of the years, I've been sufficiently intrepid and caffeine-charged to appear before you tonight with the pretension that in relatively few words, I will try to answer the following questions. First, what did Trent do? Second, how did Trent do it? Third, what did Trent not do? Fourth, what were some of the long-range effects of the council upon Catholicism. What did Trent do? He tried to respond to issues that the Protestant reformers, especially Luther, brought to a head. Luther's challenge had been twofold. Its origin and center was an idea of how we are saved, namely through justification by faith alone. This idea or doctrine soon led to others, new definitions of the sacraments, and an utter repudiation of the papacy, which he came to see as the Antichrist. Luther's second challenge was a practical one, a call for reform of various ecclesiastical institutions and religious practices. He first effectively hurled this challenge in 1520 in his famous Appeal to the Ruling Class, in which he invited secular rulers to undertake the reform of the Church. This summons to action not only echoed grievances voiced by devout Christians for well over a century, but was also pointedly directed against the popes and the papal curia, commonly seen as the principal culprits. When Pope Paul III and Emperor Charles V were finally able to accomplish the successful convocation of the council, they were agreed in a generic way both these challenges, doctrine and reform, had to be answered. That is where the agreement ended. The Pope envisaged the council principally as a response to the doctrinal issues, which he and many others interpreted as just some old heresies in new dress. They could easily be dealt with. The council needed to be much more circumspect about reform, which was best handled by the Pope himself. The council thus could complete its business in a few weeks. The emperor's agenda for the council almost diametrically opposed the Pope's. He feared condemnation of Luther's teaching, believing it would seal the religious division irreparably and lead to civil war in Germany. A practical man, he believed the root problem was reform. His logic, the unreformed condition of the church had caused the Lutheran crisis. A reform of the church was at least the precondition for resolving it. The agenda of the council was thus set amidst a fundamental conflict of priorities, which was the hot potato tossed into the laps of the bishops who first gathered at Trent. They resolved the problem by agreeing they would deal with both issues, doctrine and reform, and do so alternately, first a decree on doctrine, then a decree on some aspect of reform. They thus established the double agenda and the rhythm in dealing with it that persisted until the council finally declared its business finished 18 years later, December 1563. Doctrine and reform. Put in such general terms, the agenda sounds global, without delimitation. Under doctrine, however, the council meant to treat only Protestant teachings it deemed in conflict with Catholic teaching. Thus, Trent made no pronouncements about the Trinity, the Incarnation, and other uncontested Christian beliefs. Moreover, the council, even toward the end, still had Luther principally in mind, with scant attention to Zwingli, the Anabaptist, and Calvin. Reform had a similarly precise focus. For the bishops at Trent, reform of the church meant essentially the reform of three offices in the church: the papacy, the episcopacy, the pastorate. That last meant specifically pastors of parishes. It meant, therefore, the members of the local or diocesan clergy who were under the direct supervision of the local bishop. It did not, as such, include priests from the religious orders like the Dominicans or Franciscans or Jesuits, which made up a huge percentage of the Catholic priesthood, for they had their own superiors who were not bishops. Large though the agenda of the council was, therefore, it never intended to be comprehensive and all-embracing, either in doctrine or reform. The simplicity of the agenda easily escapes anyone who dips unprepared into the decrees of the council for the reasons I already mentioned. Published in chronological order, formulated over the course of 18 years, the decrees and canons of Trent read like an endless scattershot of rules, regulations, and prohibitions devoid of plan and vision, framed in language opaque even for well-educated readers. Nonetheless, Trent, in both doctrine and discipline, maintained a remarkably consistent focus. What did Trent decree about doctrine? Most bishops who assembled at Trent in 1545 had never read a word Luther wrote. Most of the theologians they called to assist them knew little more. But among them were a few, like Gerolamo Seripando and the Englishman Reginald Pole, who were better informed and who were able to educate the others. Thus, soon after the council got underway, the bishops realized that the justification issue was central to their task, and soon thereafter they realized that it would not be easy to resolve. Before addressing it, for instance, they had to address the closely related question of original sin. Their brief decree on that subject can be considered a prelude to the one on justification. In the late spring of 1546, they set about constructing the latter decree, which would take them 7 months to complete. Practically everybody who without animus has studied the council has assessed the decree on justification as its masterpiece. It is surely one of the most considered, for every word was weighed and debated. Stung by Luther's criticism that Catholics were Pelagians in that they believed that their works or good deeds saved them rather than the grace of God, the council sedulously insisted that justification was accomplished always and everywhere under the inspiration of grace, that the beginning, middle, and end of the process of justification was all grace-inspired. The council was thus, within the theological framework in which it formulated its decree, resoundingly anti-Pelagian. The council interpreted Luther as denying any human part in justification, grace alone. Anti-Pelagian though the council was, it also taught that in some mysterious way, human beings play a role in their justification. It spoke of the grace-filled person, moreover, in glowingly optimistic terms, a contrast with Luther's more pessimistic depiction. The decree was solemnly approved on January the 13th, 1547. With that, many at the council thought they had accomplished their most challenging task and could within a short while conclude the council. It had already lasted far too long. Among the factors frustrating a speedy conclusion was the approach the council took toward the 7 sacraments. Luther had not only denied there were 7, but had also redefined the 2 he saw as clearly taught in the New Testament, baptism and the Eucharist. The council decided to answer Luther and some others, point for point, sacrament for sacrament, a project that began in the first period, 1545 to 47, continued in the second, 1551 to 52, and was not completed until the third, 1562 to 63. For sheer quantity, the sacraments comprise most of the doctrine of Trent. The most pertinent features of its teaching are, first, the sacraments are 7-fold in number. Second, they are not equal in dignity or necessity for the Christian life. 3, they were all instituted by Christ, and they have come down through the ages in an unbroken and undeviating tradition. This last feature is quite peculiar to Trent, for no previous council had so repeatedly propounded such continuity and changelessness in the process of tradition. Justification and the sacraments constitute the essence of Trent's doctrine. Though in dealing with them, the council understood them with a certain amplitude, as necessary, including some of their implications and consequences, such as predestination. Yet there was another issue the council had to take up that can, loosely speaking, be considered doctrinal. Luther's interpretation of Scripture alone as the basis of all teaching meant that, even before the council began to address the doctrinal issues, it had to determine the basis on which it would argue them. What was Scripture? That is, what books constitute the canon? What books are to be accepted as valid? Here the council decided to include the so-called deuterocanonical books like Judith and Maccabees, which Protestants did not accept. Even here the council had, however, a more flexible position than the bare text indicates and that later interpreters taught, for it did not want to resolve an issue about which even St. Jerome and St. Augustine could not agree. What about alone, Scripture alone? Although many medieval theologians, including Thomas Aquinas, held a Scripture alone position, they could not interpret it rigidly because it was so difficult to find in the New Testament confirmation for one of the articles of the Creed, Christ's descent into hell, and to find justification for certain practices of long-standing, such as infant baptism. For that reason, the Council included with Scripture apostolic traditions. The word you will note is in the plural, not tradition, as if some great flowing stream, but traditions, some quite peculiar, particular teachings and practices which the Council did not specify. And this did not include any old traditions, but apostolic traditions, those that went back to the preaching of the apostles. This very short and first decree of the Council on Scripture and Traditions unwittingly fired a powerful salvo that, especially as time went on, ever more radically set the Catholic theological enterprise at odds with the Protestant. That was Trent's focus on doctrine. What about reform? Of the three offices in the church that needed reform, the papacy was tops on just about everybody's list except the Pope's. During the Council, reform of the papacy aroused some of the bitterest controversy because the large number of bishops who promoted it consistently found themselves frustrated at every crucial turn by the maneuvers of the papal legates presiding over the sessions, who themselves often felt frustrated and put into impossible positions by instructions from Rome. The most serious crisis of the Council occurred fundamentally over that issue when for months during the last period the Council practically ground to a standstill. Only upon the appointment of a new papal legate, the masterly Giovanni Morone, recently released from the prison where the previous pope had incarcerated him on charges of heresy, was the Council able to renew its operation. Not too bad to be thrown in prison. The cost was, except for a brief and traditional bit of sumptuary regulation for prelates that in passing mentioned the cardinals, a reluctant agreement to give the papacy a free hand in its own reform. In the reform of the episcopacy, the bishops, however, the Council, though it began cautiously, by the third period under Morone's leadership, courageously passed a series of measures that aimed, as Jadine put it, at transforming bishops from collectors of benefices into pastors of souls. The bishops at the Council found themselves unable to reform the papacy, but they could, despite the fear and resistance many of them felt, reform themselves. This meant reforming themselves where it hurt most, in their bank accounts. In that regard, the two most fundamental reforms the Council instituted were, first, requiring bishops to reside in their dioceses, and second, forbidding them, under strict, usually financial penalties, to hold and collect revenues from more than one bishopric at a time. These basic things were the foundation stones of the Tridentine Reform. It is difficult for us to realize what a dramatic redefinition of episcopal lifestyle such decrees were perceived as entailing, and how deep they were seen as cutting into the pocketbooks of many bishops. If there was a moral miracle at the Council of Trent, this was it. It's amazing, by the way, how much of the reform legislation of the Council of Trent had to do with money. Once a bishop is back in his diocese, how does he fill up a day? The bishops needed what we today call a job description, which is also what the Council tried to provide for them. The elements in the description were for the most part traditional, but they were now articulated in what we can, in retrospect, call a program. The bishops were to hold rather regular synods, meetings with their clergy, to visit and oversee the parishes and other institutions of the diocese, to monitor and show greater stringency in admitting candidates to priestly ordination, to ensure that confessors were properly qualified, and to promote preaching on Sundays and feast days, setting an example themselves. The Council tried in one long decree to establish greater episcopal supervision over nuns and over the pastoral activities of the members of religious orders like the Dominicans, but because of papal privileges accorded them, these measures were far from radical. By early on defining preaching as the bishop's chief task, the Council provided its own impetus for the great flowering of preaching in Catholicism that was already underway and that would only grow more impressive in the next century and a half. The Council established a closer relationship between bishops and the local clergy than was common before, even though the relationship was articulated in juridical and disciplinary terms. By its many canons concerning the parish, the council gave a forceful prominence to that institution, thus promoting the idea that it was in the parish, not in the shrines, monasteries, private oratories, or churches of the religious orders, that pastoral activity properly took place. This emphasis would help promote in the long run a momentous shift in Christian practice. The pastor, like the bishop, emerged with a clear profile of duties, traditional for the most part, but articulated with new detail and enforced through new sanctions. Principal among these duties was, as for the bishop, residing in the parish and not being pastor of more than one. The pastor's function consisted in properly administering the rites and sacraments of the church and in preaching, as best he could, on Sundays and holy days. The council made no mention of what we would today call social ministries. One decree for the reform of the local clergy deserves special mention. By obliging every bishop to establish a seminary in his diocese for the training of poor boys for the priesthood, the council made a break with the informal apprenticeship system widely operative up to that time, and set in motion a process that for the diocesan clergy would, by the 20th century, eliminate all other possibilities. In late 1563, as the bishops rushed to bring the council to a close, they dealt rather cursorily with a few issues that almost seem like odds and ends, but that would, again, help define the Catholic ethos into the modern era. They affirmed that since Christ conferred on the church the power of granting indulgences, indulgences were to be retained, but with due care taken against abuses. In another decree, they commended the veneration of the saints and their relics, and they affirmed and promoted the use of sacred images. These are, in a nutshell, the so-called disciplinary or reform decrees of the Council of Trent. They are the pastoral decrees of a council generally not thought of as pastoral. They would in time, in some instances in a long time, have great impact on how bishops and pastors functioned. They have another great significance. They illustrate, beyond a doubt, how episcopal the reforms of Trent were. The council was intent not simply to reform bishops, but by so doing to strengthen their moral, their juridical, and their practical authority. In contrast, Trent uttered not a word defining the prerogatives of the papacy because, had it been able to do so, it would in some measure have tried to restrict them. I hope that I have answered in a generic way my first question, what did Trent do? My second question was, how did Trent do it? If the first concerned content, the second concerned style, just as important, but until quite recently often overlooked. To understand that style, we must keep in mind two considerations. First, in the very early days of the council, the bishops decided that they would try to frame their decrees in biblical terms and in the theological language of the fathers of the church, avoiding, as far as possible, the technical terminology of academic theology, in this case of medieval scholasticism. By and large, they stuck to this principle in the earliest phases of the council, as for instance in the crucial decree on justification. Second, however, the theologians and canon lawyers they called to assist them in formulating their documents were almost invariably academics, products of the universities, who knew no other style, and who were also convinced that that style provided a technical precision badly needed, they would argue, that the other styles did not. In fact, as the months and years passed, this second tendency began to prevail more and more, with all the advantages and disadvantages of the intellectual style medieval scholasticism had developed in its theological and legal aspects. For Trent's decrees on the sacraments, this meant that for fully comprehending them, one had to enter the framework of medieval speculation on them, as has often been noted. Less often noted is the impact that scholasticism's penchant for comprehensiveness had. Scholasticism detested loose ends and would pursue a subject until all questions were answered, like good academics today. Thus, the documents of Trent dealing with almost every subject are long and detailed, resulting finally in a book-length corpus of documents. Lots to digest. Not only a penchant for completeness, but also its correlate, a penchant for balance, for considering every side of an issue so as to provide as sophisticated response as humanly possible. All this had to be worked out in a committee of the whole, consisting by the end of the council of about 200 bishops. And we all know what committee documents are like. The masterpiece of the council, as I said, is the decree on justification. What is so great about it? First of all, the language, which only occasionally lapses into scholastic categories, has a stately beauty to it. Second, it is intellectually satisfying, for it does try to consider all aspects and provide answers. Third, its language is measured and careful. Not a word is wasted. But these very qualities make for a long document, some 17 pages in English translation. This means that the decree is a public relations dud. Luther could give you the essence of what he had to say on the issue in 4 words: faith alone, grace alone. Luther, of course, had a sophisticated understanding of the complexities behind that sound bite. Yet he could in one breath deliver the essence of what he wanted to say, and therewith pack a powerful punch. Trent could not do that. When others tried to summarize Trent, it usually came down to saying that, well, if Luther affirmed faith, Trent affirmed good works, which is a bad distortion of the decree that one way or another took hold of Catholicism from the 16th century forward. My point is that the Tridentine doctrinal decrees do not, to say the least, grab one's attention or one's heart. The disciplinary decrees have an opaqueness all their own for the modern reader, and probably even for the 16th century reader, because they are framed in the precise and technical language of canon law. But to the contemporaries to whom they were addressed, the meaning was all too clear. They aimed at some quite radical changes in the public behavior of bishops and pastors. To make sure of compliance, the council put teeth into them with heavy sanctions, most of them, as I said, monetary. This meant that much of the so-called reform legislation of Trent reads almost like a penal code. Trent made no statement about inquisitions, but surveillance and punishment, in Michel Foucault's famous title, has it, can seem to be the leitmotif of the council. In trying to replace deeply embedded attitudes and practices with others presumed to be more pastorally apposite, the council could hardly have proceeded otherwise. It had to make them behave. Behave thus or else. No realistic person thought exhortations would do the job. Moreover, as I indicated, the chief target for the bishop's aim was themselves. Nonetheless, in the long run, such procedures reinforced social disciplining as an ecclesiastical style, and they helped promote a legalistic approach to a broad spectrum of religious issues that did not fall under the bishop's purview at Trent. The council thus unwittingly gave a great boost to the canon law industry that ever since the 11th and 12th centuries had already had considerable impact on the ethos of the Western Church. That is what Trent did and how it did it. What did Trent not do? Surely one of the most ironical features of the Council of Trent is the absence of a decree on the authority of the papacy. The Council did not even reiterate, as it did for purgatory, the statement on papal primacy published at the Council of Florence in the previous century. Yet this was the one doctrine Protestants of every stripe, without exception, vociferously repudiated. All the prelates at Trent, of course, believed in some form of papal authority, otherwise they would not have been there. But they very much disagreed among themselves on what practical prerogatives it entailed, and especially on the relationship between the papacy and the episcopacy, and most pointedly, on the relationship between the papacy and the council itself. True, in one of the very last acts of the councils, the bishop stated that nothing the council enacted was to be interpreted as compromising the authority of the papacy, but they did not specify further. They could not specify further without hopelessly tying up the council, which had already happened over this issue several times. The attack of the Protestant reformers on the papacy was just one piece in radical redefinitions of the church as it had for the most part been understood in the late Middle Ages. In its intention to respond to all Protestant heresies, the Council surely should have responded to this one. It did not. It could not. For despite the ecclesiastical reality that somehow bound the members of the Council together, the bishops could never have articulated that bond in a way that would have adequately answered the Protestants and at the same time dealt with the diversity of opinions among themselves. Trent issued no decree on the Church. Trent's focus on practical matters on bishops and pastors accounts for two other omissions that from our 21st century perspective are also striking. Few aspects of Catholicism, indeed of Catholic pastoral ministry in the 16th century, are more characteristic and significant than the immense missionary activity that began with the Portuguese and Spanish explorations and conquests in the late 15th century and that continued with intense fervor and expenditure well into the 17th. Of this phenomenon, Trent uttered not a word. It fell completely outside its purview. Moreover, by insisting on the obligation of residence as the cornerstone of its reforms for the pastorate, Trent might seem to be moving in precisely the opposite direction, though this was of course not its intent. In this sense, the documents of Trent are radically Eurocentric. Reading the Bible in Latin or in vernacular translations for spiritual nourishment was, with the advent of printing, a devout practice fairly widespread among the literate in Catholic Europe in the late 15th and early 16th century, although it had been forbidden in some places like England and Spain and held suspect in others. Luther's Scripture alone threw the issue into hot glare. It was therefore to be expected that the Council would pronounce on the matter, but it did not even in a decree on Scripture and traditions where it would logically have fitted and where we now know that behind the scenes the issue had been debated. In the session after the approval of the decree, the Council legislated the establishments of lectureships on Scripture for the edification and education of both clergy and laity, which allows for the inference that Bible reading was praiseworthy. 17 years later, however, when the membership in the Council had changed almost completely, the bishops passed on to the Pope for his consideration 10 rules concerning the prohibition of books. Rules, which would entail rules, therefore, and not a decree. The fourth rule put severe restrictions on the reading of the Bible and provided that it could be allowed only with the permission of the bishop or the local inquisitor to those they know will derive from such reading an increase of faith and piety. Although these rules do not constitute an official decree of the Council, they nonetheless send a powerful message and one of the forces that after the Council encouraged an official crusade against the reading of the Bible that in most Catholic cultures in time effectively obliterated it. The radically diverging attitudes towards this practice between Catholics and Protestants soon became one of the most important lines of demarcation dividing them, more important in the practical and even emblematic realm than the decree on the issue of justification itself. What about clerical celibacy? The Reformation was certainly the most massive frontal attack that the traditions of clerical celibacy in the West had ever received. It had to be answered. The Council did not take it up until the final period, 1562 to 63. The theologians deputed to study the matter were divided in their opinions, with a few maintaining that celibacy for the clergy was of divine law and hence could not be changed, but most of them held a more moderate position. The matter was further complicated by political pressure from the Emperor Ferdinand and Duke and Albrecht V, Duke of Bavaria, devout Catholics who wanted the tradition abrogated. If this were not possible, they wanted a dispensation from it for their own territories. On July the 24th, 1562, for instance, Augustin Baumgartner, a layman and the ambassador of the Duke of Bavaria to the Council, spoke at length before the bishops, arguing precisely along these lines. What to do? Well, in fact, the Council did not do much. It in several places touched indirectly on the issue, as when Canon 10 of Section 24 condemned the opinion that marriage was better than virginity or celibacy. It came somewhat closer only in Canon 9 of that same session, when it condemned 3 opinions concerning some aspects of the canonical legislation on celibacy. Both canons are notably cautious. Although they could be interpreted as giving at least oblique support for the discipline of celibacy, they certainly do not do so explicitly and directly. It would seem to leave open the possibility of exceptions and dispensations and even abrogation. After the council, the German leaders in fact continued to press their case with Pope Pius IV, and the Pope never invoked the council as having settled the matter. The Pope, under pressure from King Philip II of Spain to stand firm, submitted the matter to a consistory of cardinals for their opinion, wavered, and then finally denied the Germans' petition. The next Pope, the stern Pius V, let it clearly be known that the matter was settled, no married priests. Like Bible reading, this decision would draw on the practical level another bold line of demarcation between Catholicism and the other Christian churches, as well as many other world religions. What then were some of the long-range effects of the Council on modern Catholicism? That is the last question I promised to address. I preface what I have to say by insisting that I agree with the common consensus among historians that Trent had an immense impact on subsequent history of Catholicism. 2 qualifications, however, are in order. First, I must also insist that by Trent, I mean not only what the Council actually said or did, but sometimes, even more important, what people thought the Council said or did. In some cases, distorted what the Council said or did. I've already given some examples of that, and I will not further elaborate upon them. Second, important though Trent undoubtedly was, it was not Catholicism, so that not by a long shot can every important development in Catholicism be attributed to it. I have in that regard already mentioned the missions. Trent, moreover, made no mention about the relative merits or demerits of scholasticism and humanism as theological styles. The late 16th and early 17th centuries witnessed an outburst of mysticism in great figures like Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, which seemed far removed from the moralistic undercurrents in the Reformed decrees of Trent. The passion, playfulness, and exuberance of Baroque art seems even farther removed from Trent's severe visage. Peter Paul Rubens, with his nude little cherubs and his ample Madonnas, often in elegant dress, hardly seems like a Tridentine artist. Nor do Bernini, Caravaggio, and a host of others. Perhaps most striking, however, is the new role women began to assume. One of the best-known decrees of the Council was the one that insisted on the strict cloisters of nuns, so that, quotation, no nun shall after her profession go out of the monastery except with episcopal permission. This decree applied only to nuns in the strict sense of the word, moniales, and did not apply to members of third orders like St. Catherine of Siena, who, always depicted as wearing a Dominican habit, looks to us for all the world like a nun. Nonetheless, although the decree reflected expectations of many devout Catholics of the day, including St. Teresa of Avila, it affected great hardships, physical and psychological, on a number of women. More significant, perhaps, it created obstacles for the freedom in the next century of women, especially in France, who wanted to engage in corporate ministries. Despite these obstacles, women emerged with a stunningly new role in the schools and eventually in the hospitals they created, staffed, and administered. This took hold first of all in 17th century France, but then spread and continued practically up to the present. Now let's look at the impact of the Council. I have already at least suggested a few of the repercussions it had on Catholicism. Some of the more important for the Catholic ethos were among the issues that received the least attention in the Council, such as Bible reading, clerical celibacy, and the approval of sacred images. The last gave impetus to to that tremendous output of material culture in the Catholic world, in painting and in church building and in restoration, that took place almost everywhere everywhere Catholicism survived, as well as in the mission territories. This promotion of the use of art in worship and piety that constituted the substance of the decree enunciated, reflected, and promoted another profound divide between Catholics and most Protestants that was as much cultural as religious, the vestiges of which I think are still palpable today, at least in certain parts of the world. Since much of the artistic and architectural output was located in churches and was thus in some way or other related to worship, and by stretching a bit could be said to include vestments, sacred vessels, and similar things, the feel of a Catholic service would be much different from most of its Protestant correlates. How about the main target of Trent's reform, the bishops? If we take the long view, we have to say that Trent is, in the first instance, responsible for the fact that in the Catholic world today, bishops have only one diocese and they reside in it. Although their job description today differs in some respects from what Trent prescribed, for the most part we can see a real correspondence. We are today at the end of a long process. Nonetheless, I think most historians today would say that within a century after Trent, bishops were for the most part in their dioceses and taking their pastoral responsibilities more seriously than many did before the Council of Trent. The quality of the episcopate, by and large, seems significantly to have improved, due in many instances to the concern of Catholic monarchs for worthy appointments. I could go on enunciating particularities, but in concluding, I would like to step back and describe for you two sweeping realities that I think distinguish modern Catholicism, and for the first of them, modern Protestantism, from medieval Christianity. I will try to indicate how Trent correlated to these developments. To emphasize what I'm trying to convey, I've created two ugly neologisms. I apologize, but their very crudity helps me make my point. They are the parishization of Catholicism, that's P-A-R-I-S-H, parish as in a parish church, the parishization of Catholicism, and the papalization of Catholicism. The parishization of Catholicism. Today, every practicing Catholic not only belongs to a parish, but carries out his religious duties there. The parish to which a person belongs becomes almost part of the person's identity. I'm a Catholic belonging to such and such a parish. Normative though this situation might be today, it was quite different in the Middle Ages. While parishes existed in all cities and towns, they were, as I've already indicated, just one option among many that Christians had in which to pursue their devotion. Oratories in great palaces, the great chapels of monasteries, the shrine churches in towns and countryside were among the options throughout the Middle Ages. After the 13th century, one of the most important options were the urban churches of the Dominicans and Franciscans and the other religious orders. For those of you who have been to Florence, it is, besides the cathedral, the Dominican Church of Santa Maria Novella and the Franciscan Church of Santa Croce that impressed themselves upon you. The other important option were the chapels and oratories belonging to confraternities, those voluntary associations, mostly of laymen and lay women, who in many instances hired chaplains for themselves and conducted religious services according to the statutes of their own group. The point I am making is that ordinary Christians had several options open to them, in at least one of which they had considerable authority for self-determination. As we have seen, the Council of Trent was radically parish-centered in its legislation about where Catholics were to assist at Mass and receive the sacraments. This is because the authors of the legislation were bishops, and that is how bishops thought and still think. Curiously enough, this part of the Tridentine legacy corresponds, altogether unwittingly, with what Protestants had accomplished by abolishing confraternities and religious orders, thus eliminating all alternatives except the parish church. In Catholicism, it took this development longer to happen, was never perfectly accomplished, and Trent was only one factor, although an extremely important one, that contributed to it. Nonetheless, the net result was pretty much the same for both Protestants and Catholics. Papalization. As everybody knows today, Catholics believe in the Pope. Theologically absurd though that formula is, Catholics, like all other Christians, believe in God. They believe certain things about the Pope. It's the way people talk, and it does hit the bullseye psychologically. Today, you're a poor Catholic indeed if you do not know that the current Pope is named John Paul II, and if you do not recognize this face when it appears in the newspapers or flashes across the TV screen. You know, moreover, that he runs the church, that he's the one who tells you what to believe, and to whom that you owe a certain almost personal loyalty. Even on the more exalted level of academic theology, Catholic scholars are at pains to take into account papal pronouncements, many as they are, and sometimes seem to quote them more often than the Bible. This is a great change from 500 years ago. From the earliest centuries, the bishops of Rome claimed for themselves certain prerogatives of leadership that, though often contested, were by and large accepted in the West. Papal leadership claims escalated dramatically with Pope Gregory VII in the 11th century, and many of them were bit by bit translated into practice in subsequent centuries. No history of the Middle Ages can slight the roles played by the popes. Nonetheless, these roles, though they sometimes impacted on the lower strata of society, for the most part were played out on the high stage of the political, intellectual, and ecclesiastical elite. Outside that very small circle, surely no one knew the name of the reigning pope. Only a small percentage would have known that such an office existed, and only a minuscule percentage believed that that office had anything to do with their belief or religious practice. Even on the most exalted intellectual level, Aquinas, in his massive Summa Theologiae, you recall, has no explicit treatment of the papacy, and in fact barely mentions it, though he deals with it in some other places, some of his other works. This all began rapidly to change with Luther's incessant attacks upon the papacy and his designation of it as the Antichrist. Whereas Catholic catechisms up to that point usually described the church as the congregation of Christian faithful governed and illumined by God our Lord, they now began to add governed and illumined by God our Lord under the Roman pontiff, the vicar of Christ on earth, or some similar phrase. Catholic preachers and polemicists had to take up the defense of the papacy as an essential, if not the essential, part of their job description. The papacy took on even greater public prominence in the 19th century with the pontificate of Pius IX, a trend that has continued into the present. Radio, television, and the internet have become its powerful engine of propagation. Did the Council of Trent contribute to this process? Did it, in this regard, contribute to the making of modern Catholicism? From what I have said earlier, it would seem not. It issued no decree on the papacy. Had it done so, it would almost certainly have been to curtail rather than to enhance the practical exercise of papal authority. Yet there are at least three ways the Council can be said to have contributed. First, it met under papal auspices at a time when papal prestige was at low ebb. The very fact that the Council was eventually able to bring its business to what it considered a successful conclusion was a boon to papal prestige at a time it badly needed it. Second, as the Council was trying in great haste to wrap up its business in late 1563, it consigned to the papacy certain tasks that it either did not have the time to do or that needed to be done by a less unwieldy body, such things as the revision of the liturgical books, a catechism. The tasks were not particularly earth-shaking, but they gave concrete substance to papal claims for the right to interpret and implement the Council. Third, the Council members went home, while the papal bureaucracy remained firmly in place. The Council had left an immense agenda, especially in its reform decrees, that somebody would have to interpret and implement, but the Council had given no unambiguous directions about whose task it was. One could easily infer from the way the documents are worded and from the general orientation of the Council that it belonged to the bishops And that is exactly what St. Charles Borromeo, the great reforming Bishop of Milan, thought and acted upon. Catholic monarchs, like King Philip II of Spain, however, also claimed the role or a major part in it. But the papacy was best poised successfully to play it, and in the long run, with lots of setbacks, it was able to do so. We have thus come face to face with another of the many paradoxes of the Council of Trent. Even though it issued neither a doctrinal nor disciplinary decree on the papacy, its own fate for the future fell into papal hands. Although the Council explicitly said nothing about the papacy, it, through the vicissitudes of the give and take of history, contributed to an enhancement of papal authority. Isn't it funny how things sometimes work out? Thank you.
Professor O'Malley has agreed to take questions, and so if you have questions, I would urge you to come to one of the two microphones that have been placed in the side aisles and come up and speak into the mics if you have questions. Before we start, I'd simply like to take this opportunity to once again ask you to thank Professor O'Malley for coming out from Boston to give us this great talk tonight.
We take questions, but we also just take comments and objections.
Even unstinting praise.
Following up just on your last comments, what happened to the notion of council? The idea of bishops acting as leaders, perhaps in a representative way, coming together, exercising leadership. It's been a while, but I think I was taught that the next council didn't take place for more than 300 years later.
Well, I think that's a very good question. I mean, what did happen to councils? Because Council of Trent ended in 1563. The next council did not meet until 1870. So 300 years. And as you know, in the late Middle Ages, councils were held very frequently. I mean, every 30 or 40 years, generally something like that. I mean, is a pattern. So what happened in the meantime? It's not a question easy to answer. I would say that one factor here was the impression that after the Council of Trent that was given wittingly and unwittingly that the Council of Trent had really settled things, had more or less answered all questions. So the point I was talking about before, that when you look at the Council of Trent, it did not intend to be a comprehensive council. It did not intend to deal with all issues. It had a very specific focus, but it was to the advantage of especially ecclesiastical leadership not to rock the boat now. They've been through the trauma of the Reformation, and to say, well, all questions have been answered and we don't really need to call a council together. And again, there's this, councils are messy business. And the popes, whose prerogative it is in the Roman Catholic Church to convoke councils, are very aware of this and have been very aware of it. The late Middle Ages, one of the sayings was, Re formidandum est papis nomen concilii. Popes are scared to death of the word council. As I say, the way the Council of Trent went, I mean, it was a challenge to their authority in many ways. So I think that's one aspect of it.
Yeah, if I pre-associate the Council of Trent, what comes up for me is the Tridentine Rite, and it seems to me that there are so many so-called Catholic traditionalists, and that's the one thing that they are most nostalgic for. And, for one reason or another, you don't really mention it? Is it because that really isn't one of the most important areas that the council undertook, or could you just comment on a bit?
Strictly speaking, there is no Tridentine rite. What there is, what the council did, as I indicated, at the end, they were all aware that the liturgical books needed a good hard look. They needed a good hard look for one reason, because with the advent of printing, the printing of those books had been taken off of manuscripts, and the manuscripts themselves often had divergent readings. So there were a lot of corruptions, a lot of additions, so there were a lot of simple mistakes in the liturgical books. So they needed to be revised along that line to make sure that they were cleaned up. And then there was also a realization that, or a persuasion that the liturgy had become too complex, and especially too overloaded with masses in honor of the saints. And so that needed to be simplified and regulated. And so what the council realized that it itself could not deal with this matter. It was too technical for that kind of a body. So at the end, they mandated that, they relegated that to the papacy, though. So what happened was it began sort of in a very modest way under Pope Pius IV, but then Pius V undertook it and produced the Tridentine, the so-called Tridentine books, which are really the masses of Pius V, which was not much more than a simplified and revised version of the Roman rite of the Middle Ages. The Roman rite being initially the rite of the papal curia that began to be more widely diffused in the 13th century. So when people talk about nostalgia for the Tridentine rite, I mean, strictly speaking, there is not one. There's the rite that was revised by Pius V. So that's why I didn't talk about it.
I have a question about rhetoric. Professor Dietrich mentioned that you have written on sacred rhetoric, and you told us this evening that there was an emphasis on preaching by the bishops. And this afternoon you told us that the humanistic tradition placed a great deal of emphasis on training in rhetoric. Rhetoric is a dirty word with most people these days. I was wondering if you could offer an opinion about whether there should be more emphasis on rhetoric in college education.
I'm a believer in rhetoric. I'm countercultural. Rhetoric has had a bad name really since Plato, and it's had a hard time because it's mere rhetoric, it's manipulation, and it's got an especially bad name. I mean, especially in the beginning of 19th century France. I mean, Renan and people like this were. This was the great error of the Baroque era. This was the great error of the Greeks. This emphasis upon rhetoric, but. What is rhetoric? I mean, rhetoric is effective communication, and it's a communication that touches people intellectually and affectively, and it's the art of winning consensus for a common cause and for a good cause. And it is a skill, and it does have techniques, and but it's based upon, I mean, Cicero's own definition of a good speaker's bonus vir dicendi peritus, a good person with skills in speaking. And today, in the United States of America, that skill is gone. I mean, it is terrible. When have you last heard a good speech? I mean, listen to our politicians. I mean, listen to, it's disgraceful. So yes, I think more emphasis should be placed. And it's not an esoteric skill. I mean, there are fundamental principles that people can learn in communication. Not everybody is, of course, going to be a brilliant speaker, but there are certain basic rules that can be taught, and I think it's a shame that we don't. That's a skill that can be taught across the board, and I'm in favor of it.
Thank you.
Is that the answer you wanted, or is that the answer you didn't want?
Hello. The church history, I think one of the problems we've had is we tried to change a lot of stuff that was laid out for us in the beginning. But what I'd like you to comment on, if you want to, you mentioned the word Antichrist a couple times. And since you're a historian and stuff and study what's going on a lot, I'm curious if you are familiar with Jared Dahl and the story that this Pope would be the end of our time. There's a Jesuit who's very intimately involved with that. And also, if you know who Christina Gallagher is, she's a stigmatist from Ireland. She's fairly well known within the church. And of the two Antichrists, if you're familiar with Fatima, being on the 13th, and then just read the book of Revelations, the 13th chapter of Revelation, where it talks about the two primary Antichrists that we have to deal with. And then she has said that one is in the church. And so I wonder if you have done any studies.
Would you say one is in the church?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Good. So,
No, I haven't done any study of that, and I mean, I must say, to be very honest with you, I don't put much substance in those things. I think this is, pure speculation, and
some of there is a stigmata is that she's a victim soul for the church, and especially for priests, actually. And I'm sure you know what popular appeal is.
sure.
Some of the,
No, I mean, I'm not trying to challenge the genuineness of their religious experience or their religious feeling and so forth.
It's
Just
coming down. I was just curious, since you brought it up.
Yeah.
The Protestants, rightly so, they've just been guessing for a long time, but it is coming down. And we should study that one.
One thing that you didn't mention very much about the effects of Trent is the formation of the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine, which is continuing on today, and I'm wondering what you think that might have had as an effect over the time period since Trent.
It had a tremendous effect. I didn't mention it in Trent because Trent has one line about confraternity, just a couple lines about the confraternities, and does not specifically take up the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine, which was one of these voluntary associations principally of lay people that began in Milan in the 1530s. Therefore, before the council had gained a lot of importance by the time the council finished. So again, that's when I said that the Council of Trent was important for Catholicism, but it's not Catholicism. That is one of the important aspects of Catholicism in the early modern period that Trent does not talk about, and yet. If you went out into the trenches in the 16th century and even well into the 17th century, much of the real action was in these confraternities, as I say, these voluntary associations of laymen or laywomen, or laymen and laywomen, or lay people and priests or priests that just came together voluntarily and did especially what we today call social ministries, works of social assistance, but also the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine taught Christian doctrine. So those are, I cannot tell you how important I think that is. It just does not fall within the Council of Trent as such.
I'm just curious, maybe why the city of Trent, and it seems to me maybe what would have happened had this occurred in Germany proper, perhaps.
Yeah. Why Trent? Very good question. Have any of you ever been to Trent? Yeah. It's a lovely little town, but it's a little town. It's nestled right there in the foothill of the Alps. And because it's a compromised city, the emperor was insisting that the council meet in the empire, in the German-speaking lands, and that this was his commitment to his people. And the Pope was determined that it meet in Italy and if possible in the Papal State. Well, they finally were able to compromise after much negotiation, and with the King of France throwing sand into the works at every possible moment, they were finally able to settle on Trent because it was a city of the empire. It was predominantly German-speaking, but it was on the Italian side of the Alps. So it was in many ways a bad choice. It was hard to provision. It was terribly cold in winter, and also was militarily vulnerable. What happened in 1552, why the council was suspended, was a Protestant army was in the vicinity, and they were afraid it was going to come down and really end the Council of Trent.
Appreciate very much the clarity of the presentation, sir. The question that I have is simply that the bishops did have a little problem with money, and there were legates present from the Pope. Would you add a little bit to your comments about how that played out in the council?
How what played out? I'm not quite clear.
The issue of financial support and money contributions played out.
Well, I mean, it was a big issue in the council in that, as I said, the major plank for reform for bishops was that they reside in their diocese and that they be bishops of not more than one diocese. So if you became a bishop of a diocese, you got the revenues from that diocese. So you get more revenues if you were bishop of two dioceses. So this so-called pluralism, that is to say the bishops holding more than one diocese, was of course contrary to canon law. It was recognized as an abuse, but it was going on, and I have to say, honestly say, with the connivance of the papacy, because the papacy could get revenue from granting dispensations from canon law for these cases. So when the bishops decreed and put teeth in the decree that one diocese per bishop, I mean, that could cut into a half or 2/3 or 3/4 of a bishop's revenue, of a bishop's income. Now the papal legates, I mean, they were the presidents of the council. They presided the council. They were in charge of procedure. So that was pretty much independent of this financial issue. Am I answering your question?
Thank you.
Is that okay? Yeah.
Let me ask a question.
Uh-oh.
I'm curious, you mentioned briefly the decree on religious images at the council, and I'm interested but you also mentioned later that somehow the paintings of Rubens just don't quite seem to jive with our image of the Council of Trent. I'm curious about the effect of those comments in Trent on religious images and their intention at the time and perhaps their legacy as well. There's an old German study that has a title something like the Baroque as the art of the Counter-Reformation. And I'm interested in your comment on the connection, if any, between Baroque and Baroque art and the Council.
The decree of the Council of Trent on images it was kind of a last-minute thing. It was patched together in the last about 3 weeks of the council. It was actually not an issue in Italy, Spain, and Portugal, which is where most of the bishops were from, but it had become an issue in France in the 1560s because of the destruction of sacred images by little Protestant bands there in France. So it was the French bishops at the council who wanted some kind of a statement on this issue. So it's a very almost bland kind of statement, but it is an affirmation of the validity and the usefulness and the praiseworthiness of sacred images and the veneration of sacred images. And there are other little bits of the council too that sort of support that. So what impact did it have? Well, some bishops, after the council, tried to, there were several manuals that were written about what sacred art should look like, and there's this period right after the council called the severe morality of the Council of Trent, the implementation of the Council of Trent, which there's some Italian art especially called Tridentine art. I mean, it's very, what should I say? I mean, there's no nudity. It's extremely sort of stylized, not very exciting. But that decree, the positive part about sacred art was fine. That was taken very seriously. But any sort of, you might say, censorship of sacred art was easily forgotten in Rome as well as other places. And, you know, is Baroque art the art of the Counter-Reformation? Well, it's not the art of, you might say, the Council of Trent, but it is the art of that early modern Catholicism. And Baroque art, I mean, it's very exuberant. I mean, there's a lot of nudity and semi-nudity, and also in religious paintings and pictures. And in some ways, it's very sensual. I don't have a problem with that with regards to religious art, but it's not exactly what some of the bishops after the council thought was proper and appropriate. I mean, let me just end with this little personal story. I was in Boston about 10 years or so ago. There was this wonderful exhibit called The Age of Rubens. And I was going through that, and I stopped before this wall placard, which said, Art and the Catholic Church. And it said, well, the Catholic Church, unlike the Protestant churches, promoted the use of art and supported it in worship and so forth. However, the Church also severely censored art for doctrine and, forget what it was, decency, I guess that was it. So, like 2 feet away was this painting of Rubens of the Holy Family with St. Anne. And matter of fact, that's on the dust jacket of my book, Trent and all that. There is the Madonna, a very ample Rubenesque lady with an exposed left breast, a nude little infant Christ, frontally nude, standing on her lap with one hand on her breast and another kind of around her neck. That's censorship? Okay, one last, okay.
I have a question about, well, the influence of the Council of Trent in Spain is incredible. Cervantes mentions them all of the time in Don Quixote, and all the reference to marriage and all the canons and decrees of that. But I was kind of wondering, what was known about the discussions of the council while the council was still going? So because you mentioned before something about the sources of the documents weren't known until much later. So what actually transpired outside the council at that time?
Well, that's one of the problems with the interpretation and implementation of the Council of Trent, that all people had, by and large, were the simple text of the decrees. So you know what that's like. So you can find in these decrees a lot of sort of what you want and interpret them in different ways. And so that's why it's distinguished between Trent and the Council of Trent. I mean, now, when did these documents really become available? I mean, we now have the full record, insofar as they've survived, of all the discussions at the council. I mean, the minutes that were taken and the speeches that were given and things like that. And those were published. They began to be published by the Gesellschaft, this German Catholic foundation, at the beginning of the 20th century. And they were not finished. I mean, some of this is still not finished, but the last volume was about 1959 or something like that. So That's why Yedine's History of the Council of Trent could not have been written until those documents were available.
Well, I was kind of thinking of private documents, like, for example, the Spanish consul, like Hurtado de Mendoza, sending information about it. And
Okay.
if you can lead me in that direction, because...
Yeah, sure. Those, I don't know just how, some of those were published, but certainly if you were working in Spanish archives and so forth, you could have access to those. But you had to, be a scholar who had the time and the skills to go in there and to find them and to read them and so forth. So.
Yeah, well, the interesting part, and just to comment, is one of the first realist novel, Lazarillo de Tormes, which was published anonymously. One of the theories of that novel was that it was written by a group of Spanish bishops on their way back from the Council of Trent. And it has a lot of references to the sacraments and their, like the literal reading or the metaphorical reading of the Bible. So I was kind of, since it was published in 1554.
It's at 1554, so this would be at the end of the second period of the council.
Exactly.
Right.
During the recess.
Yeah, the so-called recess, yeah.
10 years.
Yeah. They sort of took a first crack at the sacraments in that first period. They didn't get very far. So in the second period, they really began to go at the sacraments more seriously, and they did penance and the Eucharist. I forget what else they may have done then. And they had already done baptism. I think that's all they had done. And it was in the third session that they really, especially matrimony and holy orders and things like that they dealt with. So matrimony really was not until the last period of the council. So if they're talking about matrimony, that hadn't been done yet.
Thank you very much, Professor O'Malley, for a very thoughtful presentation. And thank all of you for coming. Encourages us to have Catholics. Tom, you had a question.
Well, I was just going to ask you if